Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's panel focusing on the struggle for influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My name is Ayesha Forbes, and I'm a junior at Tufts University. From India, I'm a double major in history and peace and justice studies with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. As a member of EPIIC, I conducted research in Jordan this past winter and focused on understanding the interplay of women's rights, refugee rights, and the potential for economic activities by exploring the various factors that affect the Syrian women refugee rights in Jordan and their ability to participate in entrepreneurial undertakings. Being a part of the EPIIC class this year has been an honor and an intellectual marathon to some extent, and I hope you enjoy the symposium as much as we have planning it. So, a little information about our panel today. Iran and Saudi Arabia, the growing conflict has been historic and perhaps one of the biggest constants of the Middle East and North Africa in the post-World War II period, concerning many by its potential to bring MENA on the brink of a regional Cold War. Spurred by an energy resource tug-of-war and ever-expanding sectarian conflict as two prominent hands of Islamic tradition battle each other, and radically different foreign policy initiatives, the dissension between these two countries has become increasingly palpable and highly explosive. According to a media report, they are neither allies nor natural enemies, but natural rivals who have long competed as major oil producers and self-proclaimed defenders of Shia and Sunni Islam. Iran and Saudi Arabia can therefore easily be the designated leaders of opposing ideological, religious, and socioeconomic blocs in MENA. The struggle for power, playing out primarily in the energy sector, but after the events of 2011, far more openly in the socio-religious arena, has resulted in alleged support of terrorist attacks against each other, an economic sanctions war, and political assistance to other countries in the region with an attempt to really bring them onto either side of a potentially divisive sectarian struggle. With the increasing prominence and promise of nuclear power, these countries have entered into a new sphere in their race for regional influence, and with the surging spray from the tides of this conflict affecting nations well outside the immediate demographic, the notion that there's a light at the end of this tunnel is being called increasingly into question. According to CNN, this conflict, with its abundance of petrodollars, sectarian overtones, and a myriad of allies spread out across the Islamic world, will continue to aggressively seek to reshape the new Middle East. Before I introduce our first panelist for this morning, I'd like to reiterate that each panelist has 12 minutes for their introductory comments, from which we will proceed to questions they might have for each other before opening the floor to questions from the audience. Our first panelist for today is Mr. Bingbing. He's an associate professor and deputy director of the Department of Arabic Language and Culture at Peking University, and director of the Institute of Arab Islamic Culture. His research interests focus on the politics of the contemporary Middle East, China-Middle Eastern relations, Shia Islam and Iranian studies, and Islamic culture. He's the author of The Rise of the Modern Shia Islamism, which is the first book written by a Chinese scholar on Shia Islam. He's also published a number of academic articles, some of the most prominent ones including those titled Change in the Middle East, Case of Egypt, Saudi Arabia's Foreign Strategy, Iran and Central Asia. He's currently a board member of the Chinese Society of Middle Eastern Studies, the China-Arab Friendship Association, and the China-Iran Friendship Association. Sir, you're free to take the floor.
Thank you very much. First, I want to talk on China's understanding on Iranian's political system. There are three factors that we should pay attention to. First, the Iranian political system is based on dual legitimacy. There is not only one legitimacy, there is a combination of two legitimacy. Iran is an Islamic republic, so it's Islamic plus republic. The system of Iran is an Islamic democracy, or democracy based on Islamic values. So you see there are elections, presidential elections, parliamentary elections. At the same time, there are also institutions representing Islamic values, such as Supreme Leader, Expert Council, or Guiding Council. So Iranian political system is a combination of democracy and Islamic values. The second factor is, although the Supreme Leader makes the final decision, but there are different political factions in Iranian political arena. There is reformist camp, pragmatist camp, conservative camp. Even among the conservative camps, there are different groups like traditional conservatives, principalist or radical conservatives, and also pragmatist conservatives. So there's a balance between these different political factions. That's why in 1997, Mohammad Khatami could be elected as president, and last year, Mr. Hassan Rouhani was elected as president. The third factor is for domestic politics in the Middle Eastern countries, Islamist military relationship is the most important factor. So in many Middle Eastern Islamic countries, the relationship between Islamists and military is in tension. For example, in Egypt, and even in Turkey. But in Iran, there is an alliance between the Islamists and the military, especially between the supreme leader and the clergyman and the IRGC. So all these three factors could guarantee the stability of Iranian political system. So this is a basic judgment made by Chinese scholars. Maybe after the Arab Spring, Iran is one of the most stable countries in the whole Middle East. The second issue I want to talk is China's relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Actually, China wants to develop a balanced relationship with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. After the Arab Spring broke up in 2011, based on Chinese analysis, there are four categories of countries in the Middle East. First is Arab countries in transition. Second is pro-US camp led by Saudi Arabia, consisting of GCC countries, Jordan, Morocco. The third camp is so-called anti-US or countries in pursuit of more independent foreign policy, consisting of Iran, Syria, and some other groups in Iraq and also Lebanon. And the fourth category is a country in the middle, such as Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq. So, I mean, China wants to develop a relationship with all these four categories of countries. We don't want to have any enemy in this region. And about 2 years ago, the most prominent Chinese scholar on international studies, Professor Wang Jisi, Dean of School of International Studies in Peking University, published a very important article entitled March West, the Geopolitical Strategic Rebalance of China. He argues that China should develop more relations with the countries to the west of China, not Western countries, the countries in Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. So Chinese foreign policy is more and more focusing on the five regional powers, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and Israel. So based on this, I think the balanced relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia is the most important factor of China's foreign policy in the Gulf region. So China's foreign policy towards Iran is very clear. First, China opposes any weaponized nuclear program of Iran. But at the same time, China supports the Iranians' right of peaceful use of nuclear power. And China against any destructive sanctions against Iran's economy, but at the same time, China do not support any efforts made by Iran to challenge the international political economic system, such as blockade the Hormuz Straits. And at the same time, China opposes any military attacks against Iran, and also do not support any destructive sanctions against Iran. At the same time, China wants to find new dimensions of cooperation with Iran. First, China would help Iran to have more infrastructure constructions, like high-speed railway between Tehran and Qom, in the future maybe between Tehran and the shrine of Mashhad. At the same time, the security of Afghanistan is also a mutual concern of China and Iran. China and Iran are both neighboring countries of Afghanistan. So we all know that this year, the US is going to withdraw troops of Afghanistan. So, I mean, all neighboring countries, have the concern. What's the future of Afghanistan? In this regard, China and Iran would have more cooperation. But at the same time, China also wants to develop very strong relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's very clear that there's no any problem in bilateral relations between China and Saudi Arabia. All the differences come from different understanding on regional issues, such as Iranian nuclear issue and Syria, especially Syria. So in Syria, China's position is also very clear. We support political transition led by Syrian people. Chinese policy is based on principles, reality on the ground, and also Chinese interest. First, principles. China's principles including respect of sovereignty, no interference in domestic issues, especially no military intervention for regime change, and also to pursue peaceful solution and political solution. As for reality on the ground, we think that the government of Syria still enjoy the support of large parts of the population in Syria. And also the opposition now is highly diversified and is not a real alternative of the government. So there must be some power sharing system in Syria for the political transition. As for interests, China has big concern of security, especially the spread of terrorism in Syria. I think in the last year, there were more and more terrorist attacks in Xinjiang. There is even one terrorist attack in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. So we cannot claim that these terrorist attacks were directly linked with the situation in the Middle East, but they were inspired by the situation in the Middle East. So because of this, we think the stability in the Middle East will have a positive impact on China's domestic security issues. So China has explained this to Saudi Arabia. China has at least organized several delegations to Saudi Arabia to explain China's position, and we think that Syria shouldn't be an obstacle for China-Saudi relation in the future. For the future, I think China should improve its relation with Saudi Arabia by trying to sign a free trade agreement with Saudi Arabia and also with the GCC countries. And also China should strengthen the cooperation in the energy sector. So the third issue I want to talk is our understanding of the sectarian conflict. So actually there are differences between Shia and Sunni in the Islamic world for about 1,300 years. But these kind of differences do not inevitably lead to conflict between Shia and Sunni. For example, Shia Buis in Baghdad 1,000 years ago, or Ismaili Fatimids in Egypt, they didn't try to convert the Sunnis into Shia. And also, if we look back to the 4 decades retrospectively, we can find that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not a sectarian relationship. It's more a geopolitical relationship. In 1970s, we all know that Iran and Saudi Arabia were 2 pillars of US in the region. Iran was even the police in the Gulf region to protect the Gulf monarchies. After 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, because Iran's anti-US foreign policy, Saudi Arabia regarded Iran as the chief threat to Saudi Arabia and supported Iraq to launch the war against Iran. But after 1990s Gulf crisis and 1991 Gulf War, because of the threat of Saddam Hussein, Saudi Arabia and Iran improved their relationship. And after the year 2003 Iraq War, because the removal of Saddam Hussein as a chief threat, Iran and Saudi Arabia relationship became in tension again. So it's very clear, the Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran, their relationship is not a sectarian one. And also after the 2004, when the Jordanian king Abdullah coined the term Shia crescent, actually before that, very few scholars and politicians mentioned this sectarian dimension of relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For US, they coined a lot of terms to define Iran: rogue country, state sponsor of terrorism, country of concern, but none of them mentioned this sectarian dimension. So after Arab Spring broke up in 2011, it's very clear that there are 3 camps in the Middle East. First is the Brotherhood camp, and then Salafi Wahhabi camp, and then Shia camp. So if we talk of sectarian conflict, it's not only Shia Sunni, it's also Salafi Shia and Salafi Brotherhood. So because of this, we think that the sectarian conflict is only a phenomena or only a result instead of cause. If we only focus on this sectarian conflict, we cannot solve the problem. We should establish some kind of cooperative, collective security arrangement in the region, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so we can solve the problem of sectarian conflict. And also we think that this sectarian conflict has very negative impacts on China's security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our next panelist for today is Dr. Ali Vaez. Dr. Vaez is the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for Iran. Before joining the ICG, he headed the Iran project at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C., focusing on Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Trained as a scientist, he has had more than a decade of experience in journalism, including as a foreign correspondent for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Switzerland. He has written widely on Iranian affairs and is a regular contributor to media outlets such as BBC TV and Radio, CNN, National Public Radio, and Reuters. His work has appeared in the International Herald Tribune, Foreign Policy, The Huffington Post, The Atlantic, and The National, amongst others. Dr. Vaez was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University from 2008 until 2010, and holds a PhD from the University of Geneva and a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has lived in the Middle East, North America, and Europe, and speaks Persian, French, and English. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be back in Boston. What I would like to do today is to briefly talk about three general points and then leave the detailed discussions for the Q&A. The first point that I want to make about this complex and multi-dimensional relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia is, as Professor Bingbing mentioned, is the fact that sectarianism is not the primary issue that defines the rivalry between the two countries. In fact, I think the key to understanding this reality could be found in the triangular, so-called triangular relationship that was mentioned, which is Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq's relationship. And if you look during the past 5 decades or so, the alliances have shifted based on geopolitical realities on the ground, not based on sectarian currents. In the 60s and 70s, you had 2 monarchies in Iran and Saudi Arabia, both of them pro-Western monarchies, and they were worried about the new Ba'athist regime in Baghdad, so they aligned together against Iraq. After the 1979 revolution in Iran, you now had an Islamic revolutionary state in Tehran, which was concerning for Iraq and Saudi Arabia, so they sided together. Again, in 2003, after invasion of Iraq, the table shifted, and this time you had Saudi Arabia left alone, and Iran and Iraq sided together as the close allies. So this is again, I think, a confirmation of the fact that sectarianism is not the primary issue that defines the relationship. It's interesting that whenever this balance vacillates and one country is left alone in a corner, that country actually resorts to sectarianism as a tool to compensate for its strategic solitude in the region. This gets me to the second point, based on the dynamics that I just described. The two countries pursue their interests, not necessarily motivated by sectarian ideas, but they don't necessarily pursue their best interest. And this is mostly because their strategic calculations is underpinned by a fear factor that I've come to notice in Track 2 meetings in the past few years, which what really struck me is that despite the fact that there has been this huge gap between the Iranians and the Americans during the past 35 years because of lack of diplomatic relationship, you see and feel a bigger gap between the Iranians and the Saudis, although they live in the same region and have diplomatic relationship. They have completely misguided expectations of one another, and the amount of misperception between them is just phenomenal. This is mostly because in the eyes of the Iranians, the Saudis are facilitators and collaborators of the American power in the region, designed to, in the best case scenario, encircle Iran and weaken it, and in the worst case scenario, topple the regime. The same fear factor applies to the Saudis. They believe that America is leaving the region, has now become energy independent, doesn't care about the region anymore, and is abandoning Saudi Arabia. and is going to allow Iran with a free hand to pursue its hegemonic plans in the region. And my final point is that while it might appear on the surface that the smaller Gulf countries, out of fear of Iran, are mostly aligned with Saudi Arabia, I would argue that these countries are equally concerned of a more assertive Saudi Arabia in the region. It's mainly for this reason that for these Gulf countries, the ultimate balancing force in the Persian Gulf is actually the United States. And that's again the reason that the prospect of the U.S. leaving the region, at least the perception of the U.S. leaving the region, is extremely alarming. And of course, there is no uniformity when I talk about GCC countries. There is no uniformity in their positions and their views on Iran. I would argue while the UAE and Bahrain feel more comfortable under the shadow of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Qatar have sought policies that would contain Iran without really angering it, and would engage Saudi Arabia without being absorbed into its strategic orbit. Likewise, there are significant differences in the ways that Gulf countries perceive Iran. I would argue again that this time, the more the country perceives the Islamic Republic as an implacable ideological state, the more it believes the ideological rhetoric that is coming out of Tehran. The more that country fears of Iran's interference into its domestic affairs, the more it takes this ideological rhetoric from Tehran at face value. And the prime example here, of course, is Bahrain. Whereas if the country has been able to put the veil of ideology aside and realize that Iran is a state motivated mostly by national interest calculations, they have been able to develop a pragmatic, functional relationship with Iran. And here, of course, the most obvious example is Oman, but you can also put Qatar in this category. And this is also, I think there's also underlying economic calculations here. For example, Qatar shares the South Pars or North Dome gas field with Iran. It accounts for almost 50% of Qatar's GDP. In the case of the UAE, you have an important Iranian diaspora community that lives in the UAE. Despite all the sanctions, there's still a significant amount of trade between the two countries. Whereas if you look in sharp contrast in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, there's really no serious, significant economic links that ties the two countries together. So I would argue, and I agree with the previous speaker, that as long as there's no common security framework in the region that would allow the smaller countries to feel more comfortable, would alleviate their concerns, and would allow the bigger countries to regulate their competition, and would also permit an enhancement in the economic interdependencies between all of the countries in the region, we will still have this ongoing Cold War. And the sectarian factor will be dived up or dived down, but at the end of the day, the countries would not be able to enjoy the peace and prosperity that they could if they could come up with a functional regional security framework.
Our next speaker for today is Dr. Frederic Wehrey. He is a senior associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research focuses on political reform and security issues in the Arab Gulf states, Libya, and U.S. policy in the Middle East. His most recent Carnegie publications include The Struggle for Security in Eastern Libya and The Precarious Ally, Bahrain's Impasse, and U.S. Policy. Prior to joining Carnegie, Dr. Wehrey was a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. He's also a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force Reserve and has completed tours throughout the Middle East and North and East Africa. He routinely briefs US and European governments on Middle East issues and has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Libya. He is the author of a new book exploring Shia-Sunni identity politics in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait, entitled Sectarian Politics in the Gulf, From the Iraq War to the Arab Uprising.
Great, well thanks again, and thanks to my fellow panelists for basically stealing a lot of my thunder. I think it's well, I'm going to offer 4 more observations that will echo and hopefully complement what was said. I mean, we've established that this relationship should not be viewed through the lens of sectarianism or Arab-Persian rivalry. Again, I think much of it is informed, going back to the Iranian Revolution, by 2 radically different models of government. Each of them lay claim to Islamic legitimacy, and 2 very different visions for regional order. And the thing I want to emphasize is both these models, both the systems of government and the visions of regional order, I think are unsustainable over the long term, and more importantly, do not hold much appeal for the rest of the region, for the people that are demanding change in the rest of the region. Obviously, Iran's system of governments has enshrined the role of religious authorities in political life and given people a partial say in governance through elections. The Saudi ruling family has effectively depoliticized its clerics, and it continues to abhor the principle of democratic elections. But the question of U.S. power is really at the heart of this bilateral relationship. And I agree the Iraq triangle is important, but I would also posit the U.S., Saudi, Iran triangle is the fundamental one. Obviously, Iran sees the Middle East free from the U.S. Military influence as its goal, or Saudi Arabia historically has required some sort of external balancer against Iran and also Iraq. I think the question of pan-Arab portfolios is tremendously important for understanding why the Saudis view Iran as so threatening. That the Saudis' role conception in the region is as a patron of these Arab causes, specifically Palestine. And they see Iran's involvement in that as tremendously threatening, both to their regional legitimacy and also to their domestic legitimacy. There's an interesting WikiLeaks conversation where a purported conversation between King Abdullah and the Iranian foreign minister, and the Iranian foreign minister says, well, we're supporting Hamas because it's an Islamic cause. And King Abdullah says, no, it's an Arab cause. You need to stay out of it. So again, that encapsulates, I think, the 2 approaches. Iran, again, as was said, I mean, Iran has tried to downplay its sectarian nature in the media and the way it frames its role in the region. They emphasize pan-Islamic solidarity, a sort of class-based emphasis, resistance to imperialism. Saudi Arabia, again, what's the best way to isolate Iran? Emphasize its uniqueness, its distinctiveness from the rest of the Middle East, paint it as an aberration, something that's foreign, and they've done that, I think, by playing that sectarian card. Now, I think, as was mentioned, both states, when they sit in Riyadh and in Tehran, they don't say, let's see how we can reshape the region according to sectarianism. Let's play this, or let's shape the region through sectarianism. They don't. They're guided by realist factors. The problem is that the local actors that they back in these conflicted states, many of them are inherently sectarian. And this creates this sectarian wave, regardless of the intent of these 2 very realist-minded powers. So again, Saudi-Iranian meddling in these fragmented states is fueling a dangerous form of identity politics. This brings me to my second observation. And when we talk about a sort of Cold War or a proxy struggle between these 2 powers, it's important to capture the fundamental asymmetry between the way they involve themselves in the region. I think Iran has a much more focused, deliberative, institutionalized approach to protecting power that is embodied in its Quds Force. This is an organization that was designed to set up and train proxy actors around the region. Obviously, they've been tremendously successful in Lebanon and Iraq. The Saudi approach, I think, is much more informal, personalized. The reliability of Saudi local actors is much more suspect. Tribes, Salafis, they haven't been able to project power in the same way that the Iranians have. especially given the Iranians' Quds Force. Let's take a look at sort of the balance sheet of how the two states have fared across the region. I think part of the reason that explains the Saudis' reaction post-2011 to drawing a red line in Bahrain and this idea of meeting the Iranian threat head-on is that from 2003 up until 2010, they were on the losing side of so many regional contestations with Iran. Obviously, the fall of Saddam. Saudi diplomats told me in 2008 that they had effectively written off Iraq to Iranian influence. There was this sense of resignation that the Iranians had a plan before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. They worked their plan and they got the influence they deserved. Saudi Arabia didn't have the networks, didn't have the interlocutors inside Iraq, and there was this sense of damage control that we're going to basically cordon off Iraq, and if there's a way we can really roll back Iranian influence, it's in the Levant, and that's where they focused. Saudi Arabia did try to play its hand in Iraq with the 2010 election, supporting the Iraqi list. They lost. This was a tremendous blow when Iran stepped in and effectively undercut them. Again, let's look back at the Levant. How have they fared? A major blow, of course, was the 2006 Lebanon war, when Hezbollah, this Iranian-backed power, has essentially wrested the Arab-Israeli portfolio from Arab hands, from Sunni Arab hands. And this, we all know that the applause that Hezbollah got on the Arab street. This was followed up by the eviction of Hariri factions from Beirut in 2008, the essential takeover of the Lebanese government in 2010 by Hezbollah. So the Saudis have been on the losing side in Lebanon for quite some time. Who are they backing? The Salafis? Again, a very meager counterweight to Hezbollah. And now the Lebanese armed forces. They've injected funds into this institution. But again, what kind of investment is that really going to give them, given that the LAF is, penetrated by Hezbollah in many aspects? Or in Palestine, again, Saudi Arabia tried to wrest Hamas away from Iran by brokering a peace agreement between Hamas and Fatah in 2007. This fell apart. We now see that Iran and Hamas appear to be restoring relations, a further blow to Saudi influence in the Palestinian arena. If the Saudis can claim one victory, it's actually a partial victory, and this is in the Houthi rebellion in northern Yemen, which really wasn't a real arena for Iranian involvement to begin with. I mean, the Saudis framed it that way, but I don't think it was a real theater for Iran to play in. My third point was already mentioned, I think, very well, this idea of Gulf disunity, the fact that that Riyadh's calls for greater steadfastness and cohesion in the Gulf are largely aspirational. The Gulf states have their own individual views and relations with Iran, and Iran has played that very well, exploiting those bilateral ties to weaken Saudi influence. The fourth point I want to make, again, is to question this notion of the two states as sort of puppeteers that can play their proxy. In this region, local actors have a way of calling the shots, of dragging in their external patrons into unwanted conflicts, into unwanted situations, whether it's the United States, but also Iran and Saudi Arabia. And what we find with Iran is they've made tremendous investments with their so-called proxies in places like Iraq. And in some cases, these proxies, there's not a lot of love in return. They're unresponsive, they go their own direction, they follow their own local agendas. So Iran is continually trying to split and recreate new proxies. The same thing with Saudi Arabia. I mean, again, we're seeing Saudi concerns now about jihadi blowback. The sectarian actors that Saudi Arabia is backing against Iran could have very dire consequences in the long term for Saudi security. I think I'll close it with that point. I think a lot of people have been talking about some sort of fundamental realignment in the region where the U.S. is going to cut ties with Saudi Arabia and is going to edge closer to Iran. Again, I think this is such an aspirational, far-off reality. I think the way we can sort of characterize what is happening relates, again, to the fundamental worldview in Iran that is deeply held by the supreme leader, which is animosity toward America. That has not been absolved. Until that is overcome, I think what we can characterize the sort of Saudi, Iranian, U.S. triangle is that America is currently undergoing tactical tensions with Saudi Arabia, but there's strategic alignment, strategic cooperation. We can argue that the reverse is true with Iran. There may be some tactical alignment with Iran right now, but fundamentally we're still in a stage of strategic confrontation with that country. So that's not.
Our final panelist for today is Dr. Sami Faraj. He is the president of the Kuwait Center for Strategic Studies, which he established in 1997 as the first private consulting center on strategic issues in the Gulf region. He serves as an advisor to the Gulf Coordinating Council and is a consultant for the Kuwaiti government and to parliamentary organizations, private corporations, and government agencies throughout the Gulf region. His areas of expertise include Iran's nuclear program, insights into the policy of Gulf states towards Iran, Iranian interests in the Gulf, and entire Middle East region, and a possible nuclear arms race in the Gulf. He also served for many years in the Kuwait military.
Yeah, it's me again. I am on offer today. We get one. You get one free. So this is what you actually got yourself in when you work with Chairman Teichmann. He will use you for 27 years. The question alluded to by my colleagues here, are all pertinent and exact with regard to the relationship, the power relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The question for us is actually historical. It's not today, it's not these Saudis, not those Iranians, it's Arabia, it's Persia and Mesopotamia. It's the balance of power. The difference between the past, prehistoric balance of power, to the existing situation is the modes of transportation. You get to your adversary quicker today. Through you fly, you drive, you send a missile, whatever. So these relationships today are presented by this thing. Today, by this map. The question for us is not just to be victorious over Iran, to address the balance of power. Balance of power here we mean the capabilities they have. They have a greater nation in numbers. And therefore, we have to really balance them by qualitative means. And qualitative means not just by missiles and aircrafts and whatever, but we have to beat them in every level of the civilian economy. And therefore, today, when we talk about the nuclear program, we talk about an added value to their scientific base. So whether you talk about military or civilian, it's the same for us. We have to really maintain the qualitative edge over them in every field in order to address the imbalances between them and us. If you add to that, they try to actually surround Arabia. This is taken from, let's say, strategic Iranian playbook. This is how they look at the situation. As you can see, it is not in Arabic, it's in Farsi. Well, if you understand Farsi or Arabic, so I'm just hopeful that you do. And therefore, this is Farsi. This is in Arabic, alphabet, but it's Farsi. And it talks about this jump. And this jump is what we call basically the historic Iranian ambition to have an access to the Mediterranean. Not only to the Mediterranean, but historic Persian strategy from the time of Cyrus the Great, is basically to have access to all the seas that surround Arabia. Originally, they surrounded Arabia because they couldn't get into Arabia. Arabia is a barren desert. It's very difficult for armies to get in, and therefore to surround that's their hope. Today, if you talk about the navies, they are trying to extend to, and only recently they declared that one of their ships reached the Atlantic Ocean. At the time of the Shah prescribed his national security policy, and he said, wherever my tankers reach, my navy must reach, which is Japan. And basically, whether we have we have the same understanding of their national security in having access to all these seas and to be in control, and to also really the ability to project power. As you very well know, the economy cannot support the projection of larger segments of military power of Iran, and therefore the choice of asymmetric threat. And therefore, when you talk about asymmetric threat, we have this map, for instance, and this is another aspect of where Iranians are deployed. This is, I cannot of course show you up to date, but this is in November. And in November, what happened in November? In November, there was, this quarrel inflamed basically in Iraq between the Maliki government and the Anbar province, the Sunnis in the Anbar province. And at the time, if you can see, you see their movement were actually in order to be able to address anything happening in Baghdad. So Iranian attempt to basically interfere in the region, just like my friend ascribed that conversation between King Abdullah and the foreign minister of Iran with regard to the support of Hamas. They want to be able to interfere in what Saudi Arabia or the Arabs consider to be their back garden. Back garden meaning this is land of the Arabs, whether they are Sunnis or Shias, this is an Arab land. And it is really an important factor in today's quarrel between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if you look at the movement of their forces, they go in order to be able to interfere in Baghdad. And then later, they return again to their previous positions. So Iranian strategy today actually allocate to the conventional army the ability to address any imbalance of power as resulting from an encounter with conventional force. So no matter how many people talk about the Iranians are new Iranians, they want to really basically talk peace and sign a piece of document regarding the nuclear. We are not as trusting as probably the United States or others. If you look at this here, we're not talking about, this is the area where we expect them to attack, which is, you see the direction of the arrows. When you talk about the direction of the arrows, these do not entail Gulf or GCC forces in the area, but they also entail American forces. When you look at this is in Arabic, when you say number one, on the top, it means attacking the United States forces. Not other forces like GCC or Iraqi, but to cross, they have to cross to have to go through Iraqi forces. And therefore, when you talk about also that, you have to look at this lower map. And here you see the asymmetric threat. Here we are not talking about proper Iranian forces. We'll see a case like the Russian with the Ukrainian today. They are not Russian forces, as the Russians say. They are elements that support Russian aspiration and Ukrainian aspirations. Loyal to Russia in the area. So here you will move forces against what? Against basically the first facility in this area is the United States facility in Doha camp in Kuwait. And then the next thing is basically to move small boats, asymmetric warfare threat also, in order to really block the use of harbor in this area for the relief of any surrounded forces. What we are concerned today is not what the Iranians say. It is exactly not sectarian. What we are concerned about today is real things, real life. We are, as you always refer to, we are on ground zero. So we see them, we deal with them. And for us, the issue for us is not just a question of balance of power or moving or trying to influence events in Syria or in Iraq or anywhere. No, today we're talking about basically intentions and capabilities. Intentions and capabilities. Not only do they have intentions to spread what they claim to be their rightful right, their rightful aspiration, which is to be a power to be reckoned with. Referred to always by Ahmadinejad in the past of saying Iran ought to have a seat on the higher table for the management of the world, quote unquote, the management of the world. So the question, this is basically a concept coming from the Muslim jurisprudence, whether it's Shiite or Sunni, they agree on this function. However, the modern Iranian government gave it different connotation. It is not like to be a member of the UN and participate in whatever the UN is aspiring to achieve, whether it is economic prosperity or human rights or whatever, as being one player in a team. No, they want to do that the way they think. And the way they think is basically in their literature, as we show you that map from that literature, is to enlarge the area under the supervision of the jurisconsult, the lone jurisconsult who is now, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The question for us is basically not what they say or what they chose for themselves as a system of government. What they choose, the problem between us and them, and I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia, because no matter what people say about the divisions between, for instance, Kuwait and United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia over the relationship with Iran, we agree in one thing, and that is, as I showed you in that map, the earlier map, which is we really agree on the question of civil defense and security, and the role we play today in Syria and in Yemen and in Iraq. In Iraq, the problem, as referred to by my colleague, Dr. Wehrey, is that we won the election. Actually, the Alawists won the election, but who basically did not support that Alawi actually forms the government. The same thing happened in Lebanon. We won the election. I'm not saying won the election, it is our support, they won the election. It was the role of the United States. So the problem of understanding the situation, which is justifiably very important for us, is that we look at the same thing differently, we and the United States. The problem in this is that we do not just disagree. We disagreed, for instance, as Kuwaitis and United States, Saudi Arabia and Egypt in 1990 on the perception of the Iraqi threat, whether Saddam was going to invade or not invade. So imagine, if you make a mistake, it's okay, you are quite far, or you are big, even Saudi Arabia for us. But if we make a mistake, we are decimated. The question, the call for a better understanding and better appreciation of the threat, and better appreciation that we are actually on ground zero, and we are facing this enlargement by the year 1 minute. You don't need to send me a piece of paper. So basically, we are talking about real life situations. It's not conceptual. It is not that we cannot accept a failure in this. And that is, I call as a person to really look again, and look carefully of the areas we agree, the perception of threat, and how to counter the threat. A threat for us is influence. If we are with trillion now or more of savings abroad, the sovereign funds, cannot really control our destiny and our basically security, the impact now on us is not just Syria or Iraq, it is Shiite citizens in Kuwait, in Bahrain, and in Saudi Arabia. If the Iranian influence spread to these, and they believe in the faqih more than they believe in the modern Gulf state, then we failed. And therefore, we are not going to allow for this failure to take place. Thank you.
Before we open the floor to the audience, would the panelists have any questions for each other? Okay, then we are opening the floor to the audience. Please line up behind the two aisle mics. You have 1 minute, and please make sure that it is a question that you ask to only one of the panelists. A brief introduction of yourself before you begin.
Thank you. I'm Chibin Dalton from the Naval Academy. My question is directed to Dr. Wehrey. So you spoke about how the Saudis have the perception, at least, that they're losing battle after battle to Iran. And do you think that is true? And if it is true, why are they losing all the battles to Iran?
Again, I mean, I think it is true. I mean, if you look at who they've been backing, I mean, they've been backing people that have not done well, not had a constituency. I mean, much of this is about, I mean, perhaps demographic reality and history. In the case of Iraq, I mean, there were these vintages there that Iran played up very well. I mean, they hosted these opposition groups under Saddam. They went in with a plan. In Lebanon, I mean, they've been reaping the investment that they sowed in the 80s. You know, obviously Ariel Sharon helped them in that tremendously with the invasion. But again, I mean, the Iranians, I think, have been more astute, more deliberative. I think the real that we haven't discussed is the impact of Syria, and I think the Saudis see Syria as this pivot where they can basically turn the whole region to their advantage against Iran. I think Iran has made, you know, some fundamental miscalculations about their commitment there. Whatever shine that Hezbollah had after 2006 has completely dissipated because they're a sectarian actor. You're now seeing the Iraqi security forces that, you know, that the U.S. trained. At one point, we thought they were kind of neutral. They're sectarian. I mean, they're flying the flag. So I mean, this, you know, so the Iranians are getting dragged into the sectarian morass, and I think there's been a lot of popular blowback against that.
Lieutenant Colonel İlker Can from Army College from Turkey. My question is for Dr. Hu. In 1955, China occupied the eastern Turkestan and gave the name Xinjiang. I think the Chinese mean is new land or new territory. I don't argue the Chinese sovereignty, but my question is, does the Chinese government allow the Muslims in Xinjiang to practice Islam, and does the Muslim in Xinjiang has an effect, positive or negative, on the relationship between the Gulf countries? Thank you.
I think I have to correct your mistakes. You know, China, Xinjiang became a part of China, not you know, after the 20th century, but before this, in Tang Dynasty, Han Dynasty, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, we had relationship, at least for Qing Dynasty in 1759. There's a real, I mean, administrative system in Xinjiang operated by this Qing Dynasty. And in 1994, Xinjiang has become a province of China. It's very clear, you know, you cannot mention this only, you know, in 20th century China invading Xinjiang. This is not true.
There was an independent state before the Chinese army occupied.
I think it's also wrong. I mean, because Xinjiang was invaded actually not by China, but by the so-called Hohan. Han is in Central Asia. Hohan, yeah, in this Fakhan Valley. You know, it's very clear. So Chinese army in the Qing Dynasty, you know, just expelled these invaders from China. That's the history, I think. Secondly, I think in regard to Chinese Muslims, you know, there are at least about 20 to 30 million Muslims in China. There are 10 ethnic groups, including Hui Muslims. There are Mandarin-speaking Muslims, and also Uyghurs, Tatar, Tajik, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and also Dongxiang, Bao'an, Salar, you know, all these groups, you know. I think you will come to China to see this by your eyes. You know, in Xinjiang, you know, there are about 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang, right? And also, if you go to Kashgar, go to the Eight God, the largest mosque in the whole Central Asia, you can find the carpets, you know, donated by Khamenei, you know, during his visit to China. So you see, it's open. You know, even the Turkish president, I think, made a visit to Xinjiang before. If you know, there's no religious freedom for these Muslims, you know, how could these leaders from Iran, from Turkey, came to China, made a visit to Xinjiang, and then they didn't say anything, right? Even 4 years ago, China organized a symposium with cooperation of OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, on not called cooperation on in Xinjiang and on Xinjiang. You know, even the Professor Ikmal Ablu, you know, was satisfied with the situation in Xinjiang. He said, you know, to protect the heritage of Muslims of Uyghur in Xinjiang is an example for the whole Muslim world. He said that literally.
Has a positive effect with the relationship with Gulf countries? I asked this question.
3 questions, right? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, you see, I mean, in Beijing University, my university, Saudi Arabia is going to establish a branch of King Abdulaziz Public Library of Islamic Culture. It's open to all Muslims, you know, in our campus. And also there are so many, programs donated by the Gulf countries. For example, Qatar donated about, according to my knowledge, about 40 million Chinese renminbi to support a translation program to translate all the Islamic classical books into Chinese. And also Oman, you know, donated a huge chair, to Peking University to research on Arab-China relation, Chinese Muslims. You know, there are a lot of them. You can come to make a survey. It's open, please.
Thank you.
Next question.
I'm Ethan Finkelstein. I'm a member of this EPIIC class, and my question is relevant for both Dr. Vaez and Mr. Faraj. And there's a lot of talk now about Saudi Arabia developing their own nuclear program to counterbalance Iran's. What effects do you think both a nuclear-armed Iran and a nuclear-armed Saudi Arabia would have for the region, and how likely is it that this scenario would play out?
There is 6 decades of experience in nuclear energy in Iran. Iran's first nuclear reactor was actually, ironically, given to Iran under the auspices of President Eisenhower's Athens for Peace in 1967. And the country has an extensive nuclear infrastructure in terms of scientists, in terms of research. The same reactor that was given to Iran was also given to Turkey, given to Iraq, some other countries in the region, but not to Saudi Arabia. There's absolutely no nuclear infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Realistically, and this is not the kind of know-how that you can develop overnight. So realistically, in worst case scenario, which I personally don't believe in, but imagine that Iran obtains a nuclear weapon. I think the only option that remains for Saudi Arabia that most people are afraid of is that it might just go to the market and buy it from the Pakistanis. But I also think this is a very unrealistic option, because in terms of countries that have nuclear weapons either do it for reasons of deterrence, and for that you need to have second strike capabilities, you need to have an arsenal, you can't go and just buy a few nuclear weapons from Pakistan, and how are you going to manage them? You need command and control. Are you going to subcontract that to the Pakistanis? It really doesn't make that much sense, because otherwise the option for Saudi Arabia is to subcontract it to the US and benefit from the US nuclear umbrella. It makes much more sense, and it's probably what's going to happen. In terms of prestige, again, it doesn't really bring you that much prestige if you go and get a nuclear weapon from another country, smuggle it. I mean, how would that impact Saudi Arabia's relationship with the U.S. as the ultimate protector? How would that impact Pakistan's relations with the U.S.? And the Pakistanis, there are these concerns that the Pakistanis are developing more and more nuclear weapons. Why is that? Is it for eventually transferring some of it to Saudi Arabia? And I think the Pakistanis have made a lot of promises to the Saudis, but that's the kind of promises that you can take to the bank and probably get nothing. Did I answer all the questions?
Well, if I may, I think, I know about the Saudi responses because in 2011, writing of this strategy paper was assigned to me, so I know how they feel about responding to Iran. There are 7 contingencies, the last of which basically, all of them talk about cooperation with others, especially the big powers. But at the end, there is a contingency if the Iranians develop a nuclear capability, and the world cannot really discover that. You know that there is no such a sure thing that a nation becomes nuclear capable until it really does it. that's the case. Today we present to the world, and the whole world is, this process of negotiation with Iran is based, of course, about scientific facts and also about what we call circumstantial evidence. All right. A lot of people argue, especially in Iran, when they talk to us, that there is nothing sure about their program, and then wait. But then we will enter into the North Korean scenario again, that we'll wake up one day and then we find them having done it. Therefore, so the interesting thing about this is that this last recourse, which is to develop or to buy, as my colleague said, is how the other powers understand it. Like when you talk to the Chinese and the Indians, they say, well, the Iranians are going for it. They are sure about it. It's not like the position explained by the United States and other 5+1. When you talk to the Indians, they not only do they say that they are going for it, no, but they also have an answer, that the Saudis have an answer, and that is to get it from Pakistan. Perhaps the Indians speak from the prism of rivalry between them and Pakistan. But for me, I think what is important about what the Saudis and how serious they are, or how serious they are approaching the question, is how they are open about it. Because after that meeting in 2011, 2012, they already declared to the world through Prince Turkey, who basically speaks about their future policy stance. So he just recently spoke in the Munich Security Group about how to execute the Arab initiative with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So when it comes from this, it means it comes from the mouth of the lion, as we say.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shiri. I'm from University of Haifa, Israel. This is a question for Dr. Wehrey. Since the formation of the GCC in 1981, GCC invested huge amounts of money in the military forces. From what I understand, they have the best airplanes in the world, best weapons. But from what I understand, they failed in building significant military force. And in case of a war, they relied on the US, as we could see in 91. How can you explain it, and how is it related to their rentier mentality?
Yes, well, this is a huge issue. I think they have made some progress, but again, you're right. I mean, there were some studies I've seen, open source, that Bahrain, the country of Bahrain, could defend itself unaided for about 24 hours. I mean, there's huge problems of interoperability with these countries. They rely on the U.S. for intelligence, logistics. I think if there's one success story, it's been the United Arab Emirates, where the U.S. Air Force began training their fighter pilots back in the 90s, and that investment, to my understanding, has paid off quite well in terms of the Emiratis' Air Force capability. Their participation in the Libya campaign, along with the Qataris, was heralded by people in the U.S. defense establishment that the Gulf is starting to show capability. No, but I think it's fundamentally related to issues of distrust between the Gulf states. The idea that the security architecture in the Gulf will always be a spoke-like relationship with the United States in the center. These states would prefer to go through the United States rather than put their defense under a common shield, a common command center. Most likely under the Saudis, as was heard. I mean, many of them fear the Saudis more than more than Iran. So I think we could go down the cultural path, but I don't want to do that. We can talk about, were these militaries ever in the first place really designed to meet an external threat? Are they what's called coup-proofing? I mean, sort of strategies for these regimes to insulate themselves, jobs programs, this sort of thing. But again, I would look in terms of what I hear from the Department of Defense now is the U.S. is pulling out. We want to do capacity building in this region. We want the Gulf to be able to police itself, but there are just these huge problems of interoperability. The two areas that I hear the U.S. is trying to focus on is maritime defense, because this is a low political cost issue. I mean, all the states can agree on piracy, on maritime defense. And then the other one is ballistic missile defense is the other one.
Thank you.
Hello. My question is directed towards Dr. Wu. My name is Adam. I'm an EPIIC student. Do you believe that the strategic pivot or march towards the West that you mentioned will increase cooperation or competition between China and the US? And then my second question is directed towards Mr. Faraj. Do you believe that, or what is the GCC's perception of this march towards the West and China's role in the region? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think this March West strategy, can facilitate cooperation between US and China, because there are so many problems in the Middle East that one country cannot solve it. For example, in Egypt, I always argue that Egypt is the best place for China-US cooperation. There are several reasons of this breaking up of Arab Spring in Arab countries, but in Egypt, I think not only political problem, but also economic problem. The imbalance between economic growth and social development. So, to solve the problem, I think we should help Egyptian people to develop the infrastructure system, to construct the labor-intensive manufacturing sector to create more jobs, and also to have agricultural reform to produce more food. So all these things, I think China and US and also some other countries can cooperate. And also beyond that, I think in GCC countries, in the future, US is going to sell oil and sell natural gas instead of import. And China, will buy more oil from GCC countries. So there must be some cooperation between China and US in this region. And also I think in Syria and also Iran, although there are differences between the two countries, we also share some common points. For example, Iran, we also oppose any weaponized nuclear program in Iran. So in this regard, it's also a field of cooperation. So I think this intention is to create more fields of cooperation between China and the US instead of create more troubles.
Thank you. With regard to China, I think the relationship between China, for instance, a small state like Kuwait, or with the United Arab Emirates like Dubai, is quite fundamental today, especially with China's intention to spread, its to spread its trade routes to the area. The Chinese and actually the Indian took a new strategic stand, and to look west. Okay, the Indians used to look towards China, and if you look at the development today, you will see the Chinese ships in the area, of course, as well as Indian ships, because it's called the Indian Ocean. Then you have a facility for China in southern Pakistan, and then the Indians are talking about sending in 2016, in 2 years' time, an aircraft group to the Gulf. Today, the importance of China and India could not be measured by their thirst for oil, but also for jobs. When you talk about India, for instance, you have 6 million Indians working in the Gulf. They transfer in financial remittances to India more than in 3 nations, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. They send more than half of the remittances sent by the Indian diaspora all over the world. When you talk about competition today, it's not going to be competition over strategic projection capabilities or whatever. It is going to be a competition over the job market, about the projects that are allocated to Indian companies or Chinese companies in the development plans of the GCC. Development plans of the GCC from 2010 today are, as budget is over $1 trillion. So this is really a big market. The Chinese only recently been talking about speeding up the development plans of Kuwait, for instance. They have a bigger market with Saudi Arabia. China, as my colleague Mr. Bingbing said, that they are looking forward to signing the free trade agreement. But you know, the GCC today does not allow any member to sign that agreement as individual, only as a group. Why? Because this is our bargaining chip. It's not oil anymore. It is the trade.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, please limit yourselves to only one question.
Awad from US Army War College from Saudi Arabia. My question is directly to Dr. Wehrey about the Houthi issue in the north of Yemen. This party was built by soft power of Iran or ideology influence, and they were supported by soft power, weapon and bombs, and to wage that conflict against Saudi Arabia. So, my question: who is responsible for making Iran have this influence or a strong influence in the region? Is it because of the smart policy of the international community in the region, or especially the United States policy in that region? Who is going to solve the coming problem that Saudi Arabia trying to solve and keep the stability of the region? However, I think Saudi Arabia made a great job in keeping and backing the stability, especially for the GCC country, supporting them in many cases. So it's a good situation that we have right now for the GCC, and Saudi Arabia is working to try to support the stability in the region. So who is responsible for this chaos over there? Thank you.
So, just to clarify, because you said that they supported them with soft power, but then they supported them with arms and weapons. So I think it's really, was that what you said? So, I think it's important to characterize what we can term the center of gravity for this rebellion. I don't think it's accurate to say the Iranians opened a front in the north. Again, going back to our earlier discussions, the grievances of the Zaidis, of the Houthi movement were related to, I would pin the blame on the Saleh regime. This is about a center-periphery conflict. The Saleh regime was playing sectarian politics in the north. They were backing Salafis. The Zaidis have their own grievances. My understanding is the Iranians, if they did come, they came fairly late in the game. They did provide some soft power, maybe arms, but again, is that really, really, really instrumental to that conflict? I don't think it's the root cause. I wouldn't put the blame on the Iranians. I wouldn't put the blame on the apathy of the international community. I would put the blame on structural problems in Yemen, the mismanagement of the Saleh regime, center-periphery problems. That's the way I read that conflict. And again, going back to how Iran projects power, it piggybacks, it hijacks, it co-ops grievances that were already there to begin with. And that's where you need to focus.
Hi, my name is Max, and I'm a student in EPIIC. My question is for Dr. Vaez, and it has to do with demographic and geographic realities between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These two countries are relatively similar in terms of area, Saudi Arabia, I believe, being a little bit bigger, but Iran has a much bigger population, and I'm wondering how these geographic and demographic realities affect the competition between the two countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, that's a good question. I think as it was mentioned already, the size and population of Iran is a source of concern for the smaller countries in the region. And it was, for the longest time, also a factor in Saudi Arabia's calculations. The Saudis, a good friend of mine has a good formulation for this, which is that the Saudis never wanted to be the junior partner in this duo of two big powers in the region, which started as of the Nixon administration with twin pillar policies. But they never also could be a completely equal partner either. But I really don't think at the end of the day this is a question of the population or the size of the countries. It is really, as it was mentioned, a fundamental difference in worldview, a fundamental difference in, and a huge gap, a huge gulf, as I said, in understanding. And you can see some of it on this panel, I would say. Look, sometimes I think we have got used to demonizing Iran to a level that we've started to believe our own rhetoric. You know, it's sometimes we talk of Iran's destabilizing role as if, you know, it goes around just spreading, you know, instability in countries without any real purpose. I think one thing that is fundamental to understand is that one reason that Iran supports proxies in the Levant, for example, is that it's rooted in its sense of insecurity. It is because it doesn't have the conventional military capabilities that even some extremely smaller countries in the region have that Iran doesn't. The UAE has now a much more powerful air force than Iran does in terms of support of the US and all of these smaller Gulf states, in terms of you know, modern technology. Iran is lagging behind all of these countries. It's lagging behind in terms of military expenditure per GDP per capita. If you look across the board, it is a country that has tried to countries in the region and the bigger countries in the international scene have tried to isolate from the energy pipelines in the region, from security infrastructure in the region, have tried to contain and isolate, but still complain about its role and its influence in the region. So obviously, whatever has been tried in the past 3 decades has not worked. And the further the sense of insecurity is instilled in the Iranians' minds, that all of these countries in the region are aligned with the US in order to eventually weaken and topple the Islamic Republic, the more they feel like they need proxies, they need to support groups, they need to project power to the extent possible to counter these effects. And as long as we don't understand that, I think we will have a one-sided interpretation of Iran's motivations and sources of conduct. And that would result in unrealistic and imbalanced policies in the region.
Thank you.
Before we continue, in the interest of time, we only have 10 minutes left, so we're going to have everyone ask their questions, and the panelists can condense their answers to your questions.
Do I have 1 minute?
You can ask your question, and everyone else will too.
Actually, I think my question does not work without the kind of explanation. So just if you give me the 30 minutes, I think that
you have a minute to explain your question.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you. My question for the Dr. Wehrey, so sorry for the miss, I don't know if I pronounced mistakenly. As we know that the sixth world power has reached the midterm agreement with Iran to curb its enrichment uranium, so hypothetically, if we imagine that they reach the permanent agreement, would the United States abandon other critical issues of Iran, internally and externally? Internally, like the violation against the human rights in Iran, for example, against the Kurdish people. Every once in a while, several Kurdish people are executed in the Tehran just because of the political activity. And as well as about the externally, as we know, Iran has already intervened the Syrian revolution, as well as Iran has had the important role in the Iraqi policy maker in the Baghdad since 2003. So also Iran has, there's a claim that Iran has had on the Gulf status the issue. Thank you, appreciate it.
Well, I don't speak for the U.S. government. My sense is they would not abandon, the U.S. would not abandon these concerns. I mean, this is the fear of the Gulf, that we're basically doing this bait and switch. We're going to give Iran a free pass on these other regional issues. But I don't think, the terrorism thing is absolutely huge in terms of Congress, in terms of the way we perceive Iran. Their support to, as well as sort of the elephant in the room, the human rights issue is absolutely key given the recent State Department report. So, my sense is they would not
But so far we hasn't seen any
I'm
like
sorry.
red line, like they in front of, like beside, behind United States against this kind of the violation, internally and externally.
Well, this goes back to the presentation you heard last night about what kind of leverage do we have on human rights around, even among our closest allies. We're not, I mean, this is an issue of what can we actually do on these issues, and I mean, we've called them out on it. I mean,
Thank you. Actually, I have a lot, but time does not, it's limited, so thank you.
We're going to have all three of you ask your questions now.
My question is for Dr. Vaez. Many Iranian scholars, I think Ali Afana and Mehdi Khawaji among them, have written about the IRGC's outsized influence in shaping Iranian policy both domestically and externally. To what extent would you agree with the assessment that the IRGC plays an instrumental role in determining Iranian foreign policy?
Good morning, I'm Cadet Kavalka from the United States Military Academy. My question is for Dr. Wu. Thank you very much for your remarks this morning. You spoke to some of the alignments of interest between the United States and China in the Middle East. In your opinion, could you also speak to what are the fundamental conflicts of interest or tensions between the United States and China, and how do those be resolved?
Cadet Wing, United States Military Academy. This question is also for Dr. Wu. Sir, you mentioned many things that China does not support in preventing Iran's nuclear aspirations, to include sanctions and military intervention. What then is exactly China willing to do, if anything, to prevent the destabilizing effect of an Iranian nuclear weapon and the effects that would entail? Thank you.
On the role of the Revolutionary Guards in Iranian politics, again, I think this is one of the areas that there's a lot of misunderstanding about, and there's a lot of confusion about the role of the IRGC in Iranian politics. Governance in Iran is a function of coalition building. There are multiple power centers in the country, and they work in relation with each other and in trying to build as much consensus as possible between all of these power centers. And there are mechanisms for doing that. The basic mechanism is the so-called National Security Council, in which all the major stakeholders, including heads of the branches of all the branches of government, representatives of the Supreme Leader, the armed forces, the IRGC, are at the table, and they usually make decisions based on consultation and majority vote, and then that vote is confirmed by the Supreme Leader, which I think 90-95% of the time approves their decisions, and it becomes the policy of the state. When it gets to regional matters, obviously IRGC has a voice, but it doesn't have a veto. It doesn't have necessarily the most powerful voice. And you can actually see it in terms of Iran's reaction to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, which was quite interesting, because the first reaction came from President Rouhani, and it quickly spread the same message, which was delicately balanced. It said that Iran is a victim of chemical weapons, condemns the use of chemical weapons by any actor, but also condemns an attack based on this pretext. And this quickly spread to other power centers, and the IRGC started repeating the same thing. An indication that the IRGC and other power centers had come to the same conclusion in that framework. And I would also add, there's a lot of, again, speculation about, is the IRGC more powerful than the Supreme Leader? Is the Supreme Leader a pawn in their hands? Speculation like that, which again, it's not backed by any evidence, because if you look, there's not a shred of evidence that the IRGC even once has said anything that is against what the Commander-in-Chief, which remains the Supreme Leader, the positions of Ayatollah Khamenei. And in that sense, I think the role of IRGCs in Iranian politics is completely misunderstood.
I think in the Middle East, at least there are two fundamental differences between China and US. First, I said principles, we respect sovereignty, and we oppose military intervention for regime change. So, I mean, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in all these cases show the result is not good. And our position is very clear in Egypt. When Morsi became the president, we invited him to come to China, and he made the first visit outside Arab world to China. But also after that, for Mr. Sisi, we also sent congratulations to Mr. Sisi. And before, Mubarak actually made several visits, more than 8 or 9 visits to China. He met all the leadership, including Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and also Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. But he's a good friend of China, but we didn't say anything when he removed by the people. So this is very big difference. Second difference, U.S. has a very clear double standard towards terrorism. For example, in China, last year, 10 terrorist attacks in China, but the U.S. Always say human rights issue is not terrorist attack. Although hundreds of people were killed and their house were cut, eyes were cut, but for the U.S. It's not terrorist attack, it's human rights issue. So for the U.S. I think there's global terrorism and local terrorism. And global terrorism is a threat to U.S., but this local nationalist terrorism is not a threat. So for the U.S., I mean, this double standard, China, totally against it. We have the same standard. We oppose any form of terrorism involved. For Iran, I think, first, we don't support any sanction because sanctions don't work. U.S. designed this sanction with the international community's unity. U.S. unilateral sanctions and the European countries embargoing of Iranian oil and ask China, South Korea, Japan, India to cooperate. But all these sanctions cannot make the Iranian economy collapse. They can not only make trouble to Iranian economy, but cannot make it collapse. So you see, sanctions doesn't achieve any goal, and sanctions only push Iran to have more enrichment and to enrich uranium to a higher percentage. And military attack also doesn't work. I mentioned in Iraq, Afghanistan, military attack doesn't solve any problem. Beyond, real U.S. military attack will justify the Iranians' efforts to produce nuclear bomb. It's very clear. If there is a military attack launched by the U.S., Iranians would be justified to produce nuclear bomb. So we don't think sanctions or military attack can solve the problem. So because of this, negotiation is the only solution.
Thank you, sir. With that, we conclude this panel. Please join me in thanking